Close your eyes for just one moment and imagine the smell of wet granite and wood smoke drifting through mountain passes so narrow that two men cannot walk abreast, being spoken in terrified whispers around a fire that must be kept small because larger fires attract attention, and attention in the mountains of Asturias in the year 718 means death. Imagine a handful of Visigothic nobles, refugee aristocrats, stripped of everything they once owned, their cities gone, their king dead, their world erased in a military campaign. So swift and so total that historians still struggle to fully explain how the Iberian Peninsula, the jewel of the Western Roman world, the land of marble cities and sophisticated aqueducts and centuries of accumulated Roman and Visigothic civilization, fell to the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate in what amounted to roughly 3 years, from 701 to 714, 3 years, to conquer a peninsula it had taken Rome generations to subdue. And now the survivors of that conquest were huddled in a wet, cold, geologically brutal corner of the Cantabrian mountains, and among them was a man named Pelayo, a man whose origins are disputed enough that even medieval chroniclers could not agree on whether he was a former palace official or a minor nobleman or something else entirely, a man who in the coldness and the desperation of that mountain exile made a decision so improbable, so audacious, so strategically irrational on its surface, that when you examine the military and political realities of 718 AD, you almost cannot believe it worked. He decided not to surrender, not to assimilate, not to accept the new order that had consumed everything south of the mountains. He decided instead to fight back. And what grew from that decision in those freezing mountain passes was not merely a kingdom. It was the seed of a 700-year reconquest. It was the embryo of nations that do not yet have names. It was the first trembling root of what would eventually become Portugal and Castile and Aragon and Leon and ultimately a unified Spain. And the question that should grip you from this moment forward, the question that the mountains of Asturias have been holding in their granite silence for 13 centuries, is not simply how Pelayo won. The question is, what kind of world his victory created, what it cost, who paid that cost, and whether the story we have been telling about it for 700 years is the true story or the convenient one. To understand Pelayo, you must first understand what had been lost, because the Visigothic kingdom that collapsed before the Umayyad advance was not a primitive or unsophisticated state. It was a post-Roman Christian monarchy that had governed the Iberian Peninsula for roughly 3 centuries, that had produced remarkable ecclesiastical scholarship, that had developed a legal tradition sophisticated enough to influence medieval European law for generations. And when the Umayyad forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar under the command of Tariq ibn Ziyad in 711, what they encountered was not a unified military machine capable of coordinated resistance, but a kingdom already fractured by internal succession disputes so bitter that some Visigothic noble factions had actually invited the Umayyad forces in as political allies against their rivals, a detail that the later Reconquista mythology consistently and conveniently erases, because the story of heroic Christian resistance requires a unified Christian identity that simply did not exist in 711. What existed instead was a collection of competing aristocratic interests, wearing the same theological label, and the Umayyad forces, operating with the momentum of a military and political movement that had already swept across North Africa and was in the process of transforming the entire Mediterranean world, exploited those divisions with tactical brilliance, and King Roderick, the last Visigothic king, died at the Battle of Guadalete in circumstances still debated by historians, and the peninsula fell with a speed that stunned observers across the Mediterranean and into the chaos of that collapse. Pelayo emerges from the historical record like a figure swimming up through dark water, partial, disputed, mythologized almost beyond recovery, but real. And what we know is that he gathered refugees in the Cantabrian mountains, that he refused the administrative integration that the Umayyad governors were offering to cooperative local elites, that he built something in those mountains that was small and cold and perpetually on the edge of starvation, but that had a quality that no conquered province can manufacture on demand. It had the specific, burning, irrational determination of people who have nothing left to lose and one thing left to prove. The battle that changed everything happened at a place called Covadonga in 722 AD, and it has been mythologized so extensively, layered with so many centuries of nationalist and religious symbolism, that extracting the historical kernel from the legendary accumulation requires the kind of careful archaeological patience that does not make for exciting storytelling, but is absolutely necessary if we want to understand what actually occurred, because the later chronicles, written centuries after the event and shaped by the political needs of kingdoms that needed founding myths of divine intervention and miraculous deliverance, describe an Umayyad force of hundreds of thousands being swallowed by miraculous rockslides. While Pelayo and his warriors sheltered in a cave under the protection of the Virgin Mary, and the number is almost certainly fantastical, the Umayyad force at Covadonga was probably not enormous by the standards of the major campaigns of the period. It was likely a punitive expedition sent to deal with a persistent and irritating group of mountain holdouts rather than a major strategic deployment. And Pelayo's victory was likely the product of terrain, of local knowledge of mountain passes that turned any large organized force into a vulnerable column, of the guerrilla logic that high ground and ambush can neutralize numerical superiority with brutal efficiency. But here is what makes Covadonga matter regardless of the precise military details. It was the moment that survived. It was the moment that did not get swallowed by the tide that had swallowed everything else. And in a world where momentum is everything, where the psychological reality of defeat and victory shapes what armies do next and what populations believe is possible, the survival at Covadonga was a statement. It said the tide can be stopped. It said the mountains are ours. It said we are still here, and from that statement, however modest in its immediate military significance, Pelayo built a kingdom, and his successors built a legend. And the legend built a war that would not end for 700 years. Now here is where the comfortable narrative must be interrupted, because the kingdom of Asturias and the Reconquista it launched are among the most aggressively mythologized events in European history, and the mythology has consequences that extend well beyond medieval Spain, consequences that reached into the colonization of the Americas, into the Inquisition, into the architecture of Spanish national identity, and into 21st century political movements that invoke Reconquista as a rallying cry. And all of that mythology rests on a historical foundation that is considerably more complex and considerably more morally ambiguous than the legend admits. Because the Iberian Peninsula under Umayyad and subsequent Moorish rule was not a landscape of unrelenting oppression and resistance. It was, for significant portions of its history, one of the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and intellectually productive civilizations in the medieval world. The city of Cordoba under the Umayyad Caliphate in the 10th century was by most estimates the largest and most culturally advanced city in Western Europe. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time when a large monastic library in Northern Europe might contain a few hundred. Its scholars were translating and preserving and expanding upon Greek philosophical and scientific texts that Western Europe had lost. Its streets contained Muslims and Christians and Jews living in a proximity. And with a degree of cultural exchange that the later Reconquista would systematically destroy, and the Christians living under Muslim rule in this period, the Mozarabs were not uniformly oppressed. Many were integrated participants in Andalusian society, speaking Arabic, adopting cultural practices, intermarrying, and when the northern Christian kingdom sent raiding parties south, those raids were frequently experienced by the Mozarab communities not as liberation but as devastation. Because the armies of Asturias and its successor kingdoms were not surgical liberators, they were armies doing what medieval armies did, burning crops and taking slaves and extracting tribute. And the people caught between the expanding Christian north and the contracting Muslim south had interests and identities that did not map neatly onto the binary the Reconquista mythology required. What Pelayo's handful of mountain survivors set in motion in 718 did not resolve itself cleanly or quickly or morally. It resolved itself across 7 centuries of grinding, intermittent, complex warfare that reshaped the human geography of an entire peninsula and established patterns of identity, exclusion, and religious nationalism whose consequences are still being lived in the 21st century. Because when the Reconquista finally concluded with the fall of Granada in 1492, the same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic under the Spanish crown's patronage, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the forced conversion or expulsion of the remaining Muslim population followed almost immediately. And the ideology that drove those expulsions, the ideology of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, the idea that Christian identity could be contaminated by Jewish or Muslim ancestry and must be investigated and purged, that ideology was the direct intellectual descendant of the identity politics that the Kingdom of Asturias had constructed in those cold mountain passes as a survival mechanism, a mechanism that made sense in 718 when you are a desperate refugee trying to hold a community together against him, but that transforms into something monstrous when institutionalized across centuries and weaponized by the state, and then that ideology crossed the Atlantic in the holds of Spanish ships, and applied itself to the indigenous populations of an entire hemisphere with consequences so catastrophic that the death toll is still being calculated. And all of that, the Inquisition and the conquest, and the expulsions and the colonies, all of it has its seed in a battle at a mountain gorge in Asturias in 722 AD that most people in the English-speaking world have never heard of. And so the question that the Cantabrian mountains are still asking, that the cave at Covadonga is still asking, that the ghost of Pelayo and the ghost of every person on every side of every frontier in that 700-year war is still asking, is the question that every civilization must eventually ask about its own founding myth, about the story it tells itself about where it came from and why it survived and what that survival cost. And the question is simply this. When the desperate act of survival becomes the foundation of an empire, at what point does the survivor become the thing they were running from? And who gets to decide when that line has been crossed?